President Hoover and the Depression. In 1928, there was a presidential election. Herbert Hoover was the Republican candidate. Nobody doubted for a second that the Republicans would win. The US economy was booming, and after so much success in the 1920s, how could they lose? Hoover did win by an absolute landslide, and all seemed well. One of his earliest statements as president was, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before. The poor man is vanishing from amongst us." When Hoover formally became president in 1929, confidence was still there. He pointed out that Americans had more bathtubs, oil furnaces, silk stockings and bank accounts than any other country. However, 6 months later, it was a very different story. Businesses had no choice but to cut production further and laid off more and more workers, as you can see in this photograph. Those who did caper on had their wages reduced, and between 1928 and 1933, both industrial and farm production fell by 40%, and average wages fell by 60%. As workers were paid less, they bought less. So by 1932, the USA was in the grip of the most serious depression the world had ever seen. By 1933, there were 14 million people unemployed. 5,000 banks had gone bankrupt. People in many towns suffered really badly. In Cleveland, for example, which was a steel city, 50% of its workers were now unemployed. And in the city of Toledo, it was as high as 80%. At night, the parks were full of homeless people and unemployed. In every city, workers who had helped with the prosperity of the now 20s queued for bread and soup dished out by charities. Every town had a so-called Hooverville. This was an area, a shanty town basically, of ramshackle huts where the migrants lived, people who were out of work. Rubbish tips were crowded with families hoping to scrape a meal from people's leftovers. Through 1931, 238 people were admitted to hospital in New York alone, suffering from malnutrition or starvation. 45 of those lost their lives. It was not just unemployment in cities that was an issue. Farmers in the countryside suffered a lot as well. The prices for what they made now was so low that the cost of transporting animals to market was higher than the price they would get for the animals when they sold them. Total farm income had slipped to just $5 billion in the US, and the international trade had been dramatically reduced, falling from $10 billion in 1929 to just $3 billion 3 years later. People in agricultural areas were hardest hit by the Depression because the 1920s had not been kind to them either. Huge numbers of farmers were unable to pay their mortgages. Some farmers organised themselves to resist banks seizing their homes. When sheriffs came to seize their property, bands of farmers holding pitchforks and nooses persuaded the sheriffs to retreat. Others barricaded highways. Most farmers, however, had no choice but to pack their belongings into their trucks and live on the road. To make matters worse, over-farming and drought in the central southern states turned millions of acres of farmland into a dust bowl. Many of these ruined farmers headed to California looking for labouring work. Millions of people, entire families in lots of cases, were now desperately on the move looking for work. The final group in this section is businessmen. As the stock market declined, businessmen were extremely badly affected. Many ex-bankers were resorting, like this man here, to selling apples in the street, as they could find no other way of making any money. Industries were producing far less, and people couldn't afford to buy them even if they did. Between 1929 and 1933, 10,000 banks closed, and over 100,000 businesses went bankrupt. As a result, industrial production fell by 40% in these years. Many businessmen tried new activities, newspapers, apples, as I've said, or trying to polish people's shoes. For some, suicide was the only option, and a lot of people opened their windows of their office blocks and simply jumped out.